In the scorching Mediterranean sun, where modern tourists scramble for shade and slather on sunscreen, the Romans walked boldly with their heads exposed. But why? The answer reveals a complex web of social status, religious beliefs, and cultural identity that would shock you. Welcome to our exploration of one of ancient Rome's most intriguing customs. As we uncover the secrets of the ancient world together, please hit that subscribe button to join our growing community of history enthusiasts who are passionate about discovering the hidden truths of our past. Picture this. It's a blazing summer day in 79 CE, just months before Mount Vesuvius would forever preserve the city of Pompeii in volcanic ash. The temperature soars above 35 degrees Celsius, nearly 100 degrees Fahrenheit. In the bustling forum, thousands of Roman citizens conduct their daily business under the merciless Italian sun. Merchants hawk their wares, senators debate policy, children play between the marble columns, and slaves hurry about their errands. Yet something is immediately striking to our modern eyes. Virtually every head is completely uncovered. No broad-brimmed hats shield faces from the UV rays. No parasols cast protective shadows. No head wraps or scarves provide relief from the heat. Just hair, flesh, and an unwavering commitment to a cultural code that our contemporary minds struggle to comprehend. The archaeological evidence speaks volumes. Walk through any major museum housing Roman artifacts today: the Metropolitan Museum in New York, the British Museum in London, the Capitoline Museums in Rome itself, and you'll witness this phenomenon preserved in marble and bronze. Thousands of Roman statues, frescoes, mosaics, and relief sculptures depict citizens from every walk of life: emperors and slaves, soldiers and civilians, priests and merchants, men and women, adults and children. The overwhelming majority display their subjects with completely bare heads. The Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii contains some of the most vivid frescoes from the ancient world. In these remarkably preserved paintings, we see wealthy Roman women participating in religious mysteries, their elaborate hairstyles meticulously rendered by ancient artists. Not a single head covering in sight. The House of the Vetii, with its stunning mythological scenes, shows gods and mortals alike with exposed heads. Even in scenes depicting outdoor activities, hunting, farming, military campaigns, bare heads dominate the artistic record. Consider the extraordinary Column of Trajan in Rome, a 30-meter-tall monument spiraling with over 150 scenes of the Dacian Wars. Among the thousands of figures carved into this marble masterpiece, soldiers marching, engineers building, cavalry charging, prisoners being led away, the vast majority of Roman heads remain uncovered, even in the harsh conditions of military campaign in modern-day Romania. But perhaps the most telling evidence comes from the everyday objects found in Roman homes. Archaeological excavations across the empire have uncovered countless personal items: jewelry, mirrors, cosmetic tools, hairpins, perfume bottles, and elaborate hair ornaments. Yet hats, bonnets, or caps are remarkably rare finds in domestic contexts. When they do appear, they carry very specific cultural meanings that reveal the deeper story we're about to uncover. The Pompeii paradox, life frozen in time. The tragic destruction of Pompeii provides us with an unparalleled snapshot of Roman daily life. When Vesuvius erupted on August 24, 79 CE, it didn't just destroy a city. It created the world's most complete archaeological time capsule. The volcanic ash that killed the inhabitants also preserved their final moments with extraordinary detail. Among the hundreds of plaster casts made from the voids left by decomposed bodies, we see Romans caught in their last seconds of life. A baker still at his oven, a gladiator in his barracks, a wealthy family trying to flee, a dog chained to a post. And remarkably, despite the city being caught completely off guard by a natural disaster of unprecedented scale, virtually none of the victims show evidence of protective headwear. This isn't an accident of preservation. The ash that buried Pompeii was fine enough to capture intricate details, the texture of bread loaves, the folds in clothing, even the expressions on faces. If Romans commonly wore hats or head coverings, we would see evidence of them in this fossilized moment. Instead, we see a society that faced one of history's most deadly volcanic eruptions with characteristically bare heads. The climate contradiction. The Mediterranean climate during the Roman period was remarkably similar to today's conditions. Summers were hot and dry, with intense solar radiation. Winters could be surprisingly cold, especially in Rome's notorious fog and wind. Yet while Romans developed sophisticated engineering solutions for every other environmental challenge, heated floors for winter warmth, elaborate aqueduct systems for water supply, complex ventilation for underground spaces, they seemed almost deliberately indifferent to protecting their heads from the elements. This becomes even more puzzling when we consider Roman innovation in other protective gear. They created the world's most advanced military helmets, with sophisticated designs that protected soldiers from sword blows, arrow strikes, and falling debris. Roman craftsmen could work with leather, metal, and textiles to create highly functional protective equipment. They clearly understood the principles of head protection. They simply chose not to apply them to civilian life. A society defined by visual communication. To understand this apparent contradiction, we must recognize that ancient Rome was a civilization obsessed with visual communication. In a largely illiterate society, appearance conveyed essential information about identity, status, and belonging. Every element of dress, grooming, and personal presentation sent immediate messages to observers about who you were and where you belonged in the complex social hierarchy. Romans did not tend to wear hats or decorative headdresses throughout the long history of their civilization, which lasted from the founding of the city of Rome in 753 BCE to the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 CE. This wasn't mere fashion preference or practical oversight. It was a calculated cultural statement about Roman identity versus foreign customs. In the Roman mindset, head coverings were associated with specific categories of people and activities, each carrying profound social implications. Understanding these associations requires us to delve deep into the intricate class system that governed every aspect of Roman life. The pileus, symbol of freedom and shame. The few head coverings that did exist in Roman society carried very specific meanings, and none more significant than the pileus, a simple felt cap that embodied one of history's most complex symbols. In Roman times, the head was generally left uncovered, but commoners and freed slaves sometimes wore the felt pileus. The pileus itself tells a remarkable story of freedom, transformation, and social stigma that reveals the deeper currents of Roman society. Picture the scene. A slave stands before a Roman magistrate in a formal ceremony of manumission. In ancient Rome, a slave was freed in a ceremony in which a praetor touched the slave with a rod called a vindicta and pronounced him to be free. The slave's head was shaved and a pileus was placed upon it. Both the vindicta and the cap were considered symbols of libertas, the goddess representing liberty. This felt cap became the ultimate symbol of liberation, the physical manifestation of a slave's transformation from property to person. For the newly freed individual, the pileus announced to the world that they had broken the chains of bondage and entered the ranks of Roman citizenship. It was a moment of profound personal triumph, a public declaration of human dignity restored. Yet the pileus also carried an indelible mark of shame. Former slaves wore the pileus to announce their freedom, but patricians and freeborn citizens avoided any head covering that might suggest they had ever been enslaved. The cap simultaneously celebrated liberation and advertised a shameful past. It marked the wearer as someone who had once been property, someone whose freedom was granted rather than inherited. This complex symbolism extended throughout Roman society. During Saturnalia, Rome's most famous festival, when social norms were temporarily reversed, everyone, regardless of status, wore a pileus. Slaves could speak freely to their masters, traditional hierarchies dissolved, and the felt cap became a symbol of the temporary equality that characterized this remarkable celebration. But when Saturnalia ended, so did the universal wearing of the pileus, and normal social distinctions resumed. The toga, Rome's ultimate status symbol. To fully understand Roman attitudes toward head covering, we must examine the toga, arguably the most iconic garment in Western civilization. The toga was far more than clothing. It was a complex symbol of Roman citizenship, masculine virtue, and cultural identity. Only Roman citizens could legally wear the toga, and within that privileged group, subtle variations in draping, color, and decoration communicated precise information about the wearer's age, political office, and social standing. The toga of a senator differed from that of an equestrian, which differed from that of an ordinary citizen. Boys wore a toga with a purple stripe until they came of age, while magistrates wore togas with broader purple borders that proclaimed their authority. The toga was designed to be worn with the head uncovered. Its complex draping system created visual balance and proportion that would be disrupted by any form of headwear. More importantly, the toga represented Romanitas, the essence of being Roman. To modify its appearance with foreign head coverings would be to dilute or compromise that fundamental identity. Consider the practical implications. A properly draped toga required significant time and assistance to put on correctly. It was a garment of leisure, unsuitable for manual labor or practical work. The toga announced that its wearer belonged to the class of citizens who could afford to dress impractically, who had slaves or servants to help with complex clothing, who participated in the political and social life of the city rather than engaging in commerce or crafts. Adding a hat or head covering would fundamentally alter this message. It would suggest that the wearer was engaged in outdoor labor, travel, or other activities associated with lower social classes. For a Roman citizen concerned with maintaining his dignitas, his public reputation and standing, such implications were unthinkable. The gods were watching, and the Romans knew it. Every uncovered head was an act of devotion, every bare scalp a statement of faith. But the rules were far more complex than simple piety. They were a sophisticated theological system that governed the very relationship between mortals and immortals. The religious dimension of Roman head-covering practices reveals one of the most sophisticated theological systems in the ancient world. Far from simple superstition, Roman religious practices reflected centuries of refined thinking about the nature of divine-human interaction, the mechanics of prayer and sacrifice, and the proper protocols for communicating with the gods. It is a fundamental basic of Roman polytheism that in most religious rites one, whether male or female, covers the head, capite velato, except where the ritus graecus applies. This seemingly simple statement masks an incredibly complex system of religious law that governed when, how, and why Romans interacted with their heads covered or uncovered. The paradox of sacred and profane. Here lies the fascinating paradox that defined Roman religious life. Romans covered their heads for specific sacred rituals but kept them bare in everyday life. This wasn't contradiction. It was sophisticated theological logic that understood the fundamental difference between ordinary time and sacred time, between routine social interaction and divine communion. At the traditional public rituals of ancient Rome, officiants prayed, sacrificed, offered libations, and practiced augury capite velato, with the head covered by a fold of the toga drawn up from the back. The covered head created a sacred space, a kind of portable temple that separated the efficient from the profane world and created proper conditions for divine communication. But this raises a crucial question. If covering the head was necessary for proper religious practice, why didn't Romans cover their heads constantly? After all, Roman religion wasn't confined to temples or formal ceremonies. The gods were understood to be present everywhere, observing human behavior, responding to prayers, and intervening in daily life. The answer reveals the sophisticated nature of Roman theological thinking. Romans understood that there were different modes of divine-human interaction, each requiring different protocols. Formal religious ceremonies demanded the heightened reverence and protection symbolized by the covered head. But everyday life required a different kind of religious awareness, one that kept Romans constantly ready for spontaneous divine encounters while maintaining the proper social hierarchies that the gods themselves had established. The Etruscan heritage and Greek innovation. The practice of capite velato emerged from Rome's complex cultural heritage, representing a fascinating synthesis of indigenous Italian religious traditions with imported Greek innovations. This covering of the head is a distinctive feature of Roman rite, in contrast with Etruscan practice or ritus Graecus, Greek rite. The Etruscans, Rome's cultural predecessors in central Italy, had developed their own sophisticated religious system based on complex divination practices and elaborate tomb cults. Etruscan religious art typically shows priests and worshippers with uncovered heads, suggesting that the Roman practice of capite velato represented an innovation or synthesis rather than a simple inheritance. When Romans wanted to honor Greek gods like Apollo or Ceres, sacrifice was made in the Greek mode, with the head uncovered, apparently because these deities were considered to retain something of their Greek origin. This wasn't religious relativism. It was sophisticated theological reasoning that understood different gods might prefer different forms of worship based on their cultural origins and traditional preferences. The ritus Graecus ceremonies reveal how Romans thought about religious adaptation and cultural authenticity. When worshipping Apollo, the god of music, poetry, and prophecy who had come to Rome from the Greek world, Romans adopted Greek ceremonial practices, including the uncovered head, Greek-style clothing, and even Greek language for certain prayers. This wasn't cultural submission, it was religious precision, ensuring that each deity received worship in the manner most likely to gain their favor. The Aeneid's divine protocol. One of the most compelling explanations for ritual head covering comes from Virgil's Aeneid, the epic poem that became Rome's national mythology. When, in Epirus, the Trojan soothsayer prophesies to Aeneas that his final landing point would be on the beaches of Latium, he instructs him, on arrival, to turn his veiled head during the ceremony of thanks to the gods, so that his gaze does not cross some face of foe, thus desecrating the ritual. Virgil's description provides crucial insight into Roman thinking about religious vulnerability. The veil didn't just show respect to the gods, it protected the sacred ritual from contamination by hostile or impure influences. During moments of divine communion, when the barrier between mortal and immortal worlds became permeable, humans were understood to be particularly susceptible to spiritual pollution. This concept of religious contamination was central to Roman practice. Romans believed that seeing certain things during religious ceremonies, the face of an enemy, an inauspicious omen, an unclean person or object, could disrupt the communication with divine forces and render the entire ritual ineffective or even dangerous. The covered head created a kind of spiritual filter, allowing the worshipper to focus entirely on the divine while screening out potentially harmful influences. But this protection was precisely targeted and temporarily limited. Covering the head unnecessarily, outside of formal religious contexts, might suggest several problematic things: that the person was presumptuous enough to assume they were in constant divine communion, that they lacked confidence in their spiritual purity, or that they were engaging in foreign religious practices that required different protocols. The emperor's divine balancing act. The complexity of Roman head-covering practices becomes even more apparent when we examine the religious role of the emperor. Some ancient statues of Caesar Augustus show him with a covered head because he was the Pontifex Maximus of Rome, and because he was interested in promoting the traditional values of the Romans for political reasons. As Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, the emperor had to model proper religious behavior for the entire empire. When conducting official religious ceremonies, Augustus appeared with his head covered according to ancient protocol. But in his everyday appearances as a political leader and military commander, he appeared with his head uncovered like any other Roman citizen. This dual presentation wasn't hypocrisy. It was sophisticated political theology. Augustus understood that the emperor occupied a unique position in Roman cosmology, serving simultaneously as a mortal ruler and a semi-divine figure. Different aspects of his role required different religious presentations. As Pontifex Maximus communicating with the gods, he covered his head. As emperor communicating with his subjects, he kept it uncovered. The political implications were enormous. By scrupulously following traditional religious protocols, Augustus demonstrated that even the most powerful man in Rome submitted to divine authority and ancestral custom. This humility before the gods reinforced his legitimacy as a ruler, while reassuring Romans that imperial power wouldn't overturn the religious traditions that formed the foundation of Roman identity. The theological logic of everyday exposure. For ordinary Romans, daily life required constant readiness for spontaneous religious observances. Romans encountered religious situations throughout their normal routines, passing household shrines, witnessing omens, participating in neighborhood festivals, or simply invoking the gods in everyday conversation. Covering the head unnecessarily might suggest they were perpetually engaged in formal ritual activity, a presumption that could be seen as hubris toward the gods. Roman theology was fundamentally practical. The gods were understood to appreciate proper respect, but they also valued efficiency and authenticity. Constantly covering the head would be like constantly speaking in the formal language used for religious prayers. Technically respectful, but ultimately impractical and potentially offensive in its artificiality. Moreover, Roman religion emphasized the importance of clear communication between mortals and immortals. The gods needed to be able to see and recognize their human worshippers. An always covered head might impede this divine recognition, creating barriers to the kind of personal relationship that Romans sought to maintain with their patron deities. Women's complex, religious navigation. The situation for Roman women reveals even more sophisticated religious thinking. It was important for a woman to maintain her modesty and demeanor. This meant that a married woman would often wear the palla, which could be pulled up over her head from behind, or some other kind of veil or shawl. But women's head covering wasn't simply about religious protocol. It was about navigating the complex intersection of religious law, social expectations, and personal safety. The costume of the matron signified her modesty and chastity, her pudicitia. It consisted of her distinctive dress, the woolen stola, which was worn over a tunic, the protective woolen bands which dressed her hair, and the woolen palla or mantle, which was used to veil her head when she went out in public. The religious function of women's veiling was explicitly protective. The veil protected the married woman from religiously impure things, limiting the likelihood of her seeing some omen, object, or act that would diminish her purity. Women were understood to be particularly vulnerable to certain kinds of spiritual contamination, especially those related to sexuality, violence, or death. Yet this protection was selective and situational, not a constant requirement. There is plenty of evidence that it was more usual for women to cover their heads, as Plutarch implies. But the ancient sources give us little reason to think that in the 1st century a respectable Roman woman would never appear in public with her head uncovered. Roman women enjoyed considerably more public freedom than their counterparts in many other ancient civilizations, and their head-covering practices reflected this relative liberty. A woman might cover her head when attending certain religious ceremonies, when traveling through unfamiliar neighborhoods, or when her husband's social position required extra displays of modesty. But she wasn't required to remain constantly veiled like women in some other ancient societies. The theological architecture of daily life. Understanding Roman head-covering practices requires recognizing that Romans lived in a thoroughly theologized world. Every aspect of daily life, from the food they ate, to the clothes they wore, to the words they spoke, carried religious implications. In such a world, the decision to keep one's head uncovered wasn't secular. It was a continuous religious choice that demonstrated proper understanding of divine human relationships. The bare head announced several things simultaneously: that the wearer was a Roman citizen, familiar with proper religious protocols; that they were currently engaged in ordinary rather than sacred activities; that they were prepared to cover their head immediately if religious circumstances required it; and that they possessed the spiritual confidence to appear before the gods without the protection that veiling provided. This last point was particularly significant. Roman religion emphasized personal responsibility and individual relationship with divine forces. Constantly covering the head might suggest spiritual insecurity or lack of confidence in one's relationship with the gods. For Romans, true piety meant being secure enough in divine favor to appear before the gods with uncovered head, while remaining humble enough to cover it when formal religious protocols demanded such respect. The sophisticated nature of this system becomes clear when we consider its flexibility and responsiveness to context. Romans didn't follow rigid rules about head covering. They navigated complex situational requirements that demonstrated their religious sophistication and cultural competence. A Roman who understood when to cover and when to uncover the head showed mastery of the intricate social and religious codes that defined Roman civilization. If this exploration of Roman religious complexity has fascinated you, please give this video a thumbs up. It helps us continue bringing you these detailed historical investigations. The intersection of daily life and divine communication in ancient Rome reveals layers of meaning that continue to influence Western civilization today. What aspects of Roman religious practice would you like us to explore next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. We read every single one and often base our future videos on your requests. Coming up next, we'll examine how head-covering practices reflected and reinforced the complex social hierarchies that held the Roman Empire together for over 1,000 years.